So if I switch a gene on and it starts producing a new protein that it wasn't producing, that cell changes what it is and how it behaves. Just as if I switch a gene off, that cell will change how it behaves as well. The other thing about cells, they have to divide. So here's my simple cell, and when a cell divides, the first thing it has to do is copy all of the DNA. If cells divide and you don't do that, one cell divides into two, you end up with half the amount of DNA, and then it'll divide into four, you get a quarter of the DNA. So every time a cell divides, you must copy your DNA, all your genes in your body. And so you copy your DNA, it's the genes, you get a cell with two nuclei, then it separates into two cells. That's how cells divide, they have to do that. And so then they have to copy that DNA faithfully. And occasionally that goes wrong. We get a mistake. That's what we call a mutation. So in this process, when cells are dividing, sometimes the cells that aren't dividing, but we have this DNA code which must be maintained. If we make a mistake, that's called a mutation. So you get a gene that's altered. And there are different types, I'll show you in a minute. A lot of the DNA is we don't know what it's for. Only about 10% of the DNA codes for genes that we can understand. About 90% we don't know quite what it's for, although it probably is important. But a lot of changes or mutations in that DNA between genes doesn't seem to make any difference to the cells. Okay? If you mutate or damage an important gene that's important for that cell to function, to be alive, the cell just dies. And that's not usually a big problem because cells aren't in isolation. They're usually millions of them dividing at the same time. And if one gets a lethal mutation in a gene, that cell dies. There's millions of others doing the same thing. It's not a big problem. The real problem occurs that if you get a mutation that changes the way a cell behaves, that's when we get trouble. And that's how all cancers develop and how most blood diseases develop. So we get cells behaving badly. So that's a bit of background. And then I guess I want to move back now to the bone marrow. And I don't know, there comes a time when you've got sort of your children. These are my children. It's not a good idea, I believe, to go on the internet and look up children in bath. It's one way to get men to come and knock on your door and take your computer away. I have their consent to use this photo. The boys don't care. This is my daughter. This is about 15 years ago when they were nice, actually. And I said to her, look, I want to use this photo for this talk. And she said, she looked me in the eye and she said, if you use that photo, I'll sue you for every cent you've got. So I thought about it, so I pulled a $10 note out and waved it. She grabbed it, said deal. So I have her consent. And there comes a time when your kids are in the bath and then one of them gets a bit thoughtful and asks a hard question. Where do blood cells come from? This haematologist's children are slightly different from other children. And blood cells come from the bone marrow. So the cells that circulate around our body and the blood are all made in the bone marrow. And there are three main types. The red blood cells, and I'm going to go through these in more detail, the white blood cells and the platelets. And this is what's called an electron microscope picture. It comes in black and white, but you can see they're slightly different shapes and sizes. This is a red blood cell, that's one of the platelets, and that's a white blood cell. These are red blood cells, and they're red blood cells because they're red. Okay, that's why blood is red. Okay, and you can notice that this is an artist's impression really, but you notice how they look like they're sort of almost a donut. They've got a sort of sunken centre. They're like a disc with a slightly sunken centre. We call it a biconcave disc. And when we stain blood and look at it down the microscope, this is what those cells look like. That slight pale area in the centre is that sort of flattened part of it with a sort of bulge around the edge. And this is what normal red blood cells look like. And they're like that, we think, because it makes it very easy for them to sort of slide in little spaces in the capillaries around the body. And as they get old and they struggle to do that, they get removed from the circulation. So we think that shape's quite important. And that's held like that by various proteins which hold that, what we call the cytoskeleton. That sort of shape of that cell is held by certain proteins. Okay? We have 5 trillion of those per litre of blood. That's 5 with 12 zeros behind. Okay? That's a lot of cells. And because they only last a short period of time, we have to make 200 billion every day. Okay? The bone marrow is producing 200 with 9 zeros behind it, red blood cells every day. And they last for nearly 3 months. So a red blood cell appearing out of my bone marrow today will probably do its business for about 3 months, and it starts to get a bit tatty and then gets removed from the circulation, usually by the spleen, okay, and other parts of the body. And they're very simple. They actually lose their nucleus during division, during development in the bone marrow. They're really a bag of this protein, this red protein called hemoglobin, which has iron in it. And that's very important because it binds oxygen. And so the oxygen we take in our lungs gets taken up by the red blood cells in our lungs and then circulated around the body and then goes to the muscles and other places where that oxygen's then released to the tissues which need oxygen to survive, obviously. They're very simple. They do have a couple of enzymes to keep all the proteins stable and to generate a wee bit of energy, but they're very simple cells, red blood cells, and we've got vast quantities of them. Okay, so their job's to carry oxygen around the body. White blood cells, these are the red blood cells here. This is again an artist's impression. If you take blood and stand it, the red blood cells fall to the bottom, they look red, and then the white blood cells just look sort of, we call it buffy, but it's sort of a whitey grey colour, so they sort of look white. When we stain them though, we stain them so we can see them, so we stain them down the microscope. These are the red blood cells. These are a couple of neutrophils, which are a type of white blood cells. They're a bit bigger, and we stain them to make them so we can distinguish the different types, okay? So they're not white when we stain them, but they are in your bloodstream. And we have about 4 to 10 billion of those per litre of blood, so about 1,000-fold less, okay? So you've got about 4 to 5 trillion red blood cells, 4 to 5 billion white blood cells per litre. So you know when we talk about your blood count being 4.5, it's 4.5 times 10 to the 9 per litre, 4.5 billion per litre, okay? And they last for a few hours a week. Some of them, these neutrophils, tend to only go into the bloodstream for a few hours, mop up an infection and then die. Some of them last a bit longer, particularly the lymphocytes, which I'll come on to. And their job, white blood cells fight infection. That's their job. They're the sort of defence system of the body. And there are different types. I've mentioned neutrophils. They're like the foot soldiers. They just go out. If there's a bug gets into the system, the neutrophils go out and they kill them by ingesting them. So bugs get sort of ingested by these cells, get destroyed in those things. I've mentioned the lysozymes, which sort of break down things in the cells. There are things called lymphocytes, and they're more the immune system. That's much more sophisticated. So they kind of, if you think of the army analogy, they're the generals and the heavy artillery. They produce things called antibodies, which is like artillery. So they're much more sophisticated. And lymphocytes can have memory. Okay, so they can actually, we can see a bug, and the lymphocytes carry that sort of memory, that immune system, which means that if it comes back, we can get it, which is why we vaccinate people. So we can fight it more effectively if we've seen it before. And then the monocytes are sort of special white blood cells which get into the tissue. Think of them as the SAS, they get parachuted behind the enemy lines. And then these things called eosinophils and basophils, and to be fair, we mostly see them in allergic type reactions, so I think of them as the protesters, okay, in the analogy. Platelets, the other term for platelets, thrombo means clot, and you can, thrombocytes is a clot cell. So platelets are, and they're not really cells. This is a picture of blood. Again, we've got those red blood cells and these big white blood cells. Platelets are these little sort of funny shaped things. They're much smaller, or significantly smaller. And again, this has a whole load of them, and they're different sizes and they're sort of granular. And they're not actually cells, they're actually produced from cells, and I'll show you that in a minute. And they're somewhere in between, about 150 to 400 billion per litre in the bloodstream. So a normal platelet count is 150 to 400 times 10 to the 9 per litre. And they last for about 8 to 12 days, okay? If we transfuse platelets, they only last for a couple of days, because transfused platelets obviously come from a donor and they're not fresh out of the bone marrow. Some are, but some are old, and so transfusion, the length at which red blood cells or platelets will last as a transfusion is shorter than what I'm saying here, because when we transfuse blood cells, they're not all fresh out of the donor's bone marrow, they're a mixture, okay? And these cells in the bone marrow, these huge cells called megakaryocytes, they actually just bud off bits of that cytoplasm, and that's what platelets are, so they're really fragments of cells. And their job is to initiate clots. So if you cut yourself, the platelets sort of stick to the site of injury and sort of get activated and form a platform really, or a plug on which the sort of clotting proteins, which are in the liquid part of the blood, can come out of solution and form a stable clot. So that, if you like, they start the clotting process. So that's platelets. And then finally, I've sort of alluded to this, there are two components to bone marrow. The cells don't just float around free, because it would be chaos otherwise. So actually, there is this stromal component, these supporting cells. So bone marrow has fat cells in it. It has these things called fibroblasts, which lay down sort of proteins, which are like the scaffolding on which the cells sit. The macrophages, I've said, are sort of specialised cells which are in there to sort of, they sort of ingest some of the blood cells which don't quite make it out into the blood. And then we've got these cells which make bone, osteoblasts, and cells which break down bone called osteoclasts. And they're all part of what we call the stroma, or the supporting structure in the bone marrow. And secondly, we have these blood cells, or hematopoietic cells, blood-forming cells. And I'm going to go through these in detail, but they start with stem cells, which are the earliest ones, and then sort of not quite so early, but quite early cells called progenitor cells. Immature cells are called blasts, and then we have promyelocytes, and all these cells. These are all bone marrow cells. These erythroblasts are the cells that are going to grow up and become red blood cells. And a megakaryocytes are the cells that their cytoplasm buds off to make those platelets that we mentioned. And this is what it looks